As we wrap up our conversation on the Industrial Revolution, it's now time to look at the effects that it has on the workers' rights, as well as the idea of Marxism and socialism. That'll tie itself into the idea of communism a little bit, and then we'll talk about a little bit of European migration as a result, again, continuing out of the Industrial Revolution. So, the Industrial Revolution created a lot of different wealth inequalities, and including the ability to actually see those inequalities between the different social classes. At the same time, we also begin to see with urbanization, more people working in the actual factories, you're now also seeing them in many cases, many people overworked and mistreated, and a lot of inequities in terms of living situations, leading to various critiques, protests, and social movements that again develop as a result of all this. And it's not to say that, social groups and social inequality didn't exist before, or that workers' protests didn't occur in the past. But because now that so many people are beginning to work in industry and manufacturing, and that their entire livelihood is now tied to the actual manufacturing process, you begin to see more people now critique and be more ardent opponents of poor workers' rights in terms of more favorable treatments of the working class. So this group that we kind of get develops out of this time frame with the Industrial Revolution, known as the socialists or the socialist movements. And there's a number of different types of socialist movements out there. The one we're going to mostly focus on today is going to be that which is pushed forward by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, writers of the Communist Manifesto. So the idea behind socialism in general, as it began as a result of the Industrial Revolution, ties itself into the idea of building a utopian society to serve the people that has very few inequities involved in it. So this means that everyone got sort of the same pay, access to healthcare, voting rights, things of that nature, in order to deal with, the inequalities that were essentially being grown up and exacerbated by, the inequalities with the Industrial Revolution. So the focus changes to create workers' organizations in order to achieve this, because the idea was, where do we even go about beginning to try and achieve better work standards, better equality for the working classes. And so this is what they start to look for, is the better standards of work, better standards of living. We talked about the problems with, urbanization and that. So this is kind of a response to all of those things. All right, and it gains a number of large followings around the world, although the issue becomes on how do we actually achieve these things. So there's a lot of different talk on terms of what can they actually do for that. All right. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write the Communist Manifesto in the mid-1840s. Marx having kind of observed the plight of the industrial worker in England for a time in the 18-teens and 1820s, and a little bit in the 30s, right around the time that we're also seeing nationalist movements starting to build up throughout Europe, including in Germany, where they are both from. I believe they were both actually technically Prussian, but I'm not exactly sure of the location or if that's correct, so don't hold me to that. All right, so they also write in the Communist Manifesto their opinion on the ideas of history. And so they take not just the idea of socialism in a new direction, but that history itself is the history of class conflict. Everything in history has been built up between the haves and the have-nots, or as they write in their book, the elite, the haves, capitalists, also known as the bourgeoisie, spelled out over here. And on the other side, you have the have-nots, the working class poor, your laborers, also known as the proletariat. And this, as that they kind of illuminate, is getting worse and worse and worse, again, resulting from the Industrial Revolution. And the idea of capitalism is not making this any better. Okay, so they also say that because the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the haves, own the mean of production, so they own the machines, they own the factories. They are the ones who also own the jobs, while the proletariat and the working class are just being exploited in order to give more profit and more power to the bourgeoisie. And that all parts of culture are essentially distractions to keep the bourgeoisie and the capitalists in power. This included things of culture, music, religion. It's all to serve as distractions in order for them to sort of essentially be, in their words, blinded by how bad things are. So, life is hard. Well, here's a book for you to read. Oh, life is hard. Here, go see some theater shows. Oh, life is hard. Well, in the next life, heaven is waiting for those who work hard and believe. So this is kind of your reward for that stuff on Earth. To which, you have the big quote by Karl Marx, who says that, religion is, and this is kind of the adapted version, the opium of the masses, or essentially it's meant to essentially keep you blind to how you're being mistreated in this life so that you can be rewarded in the next life. And all this ends up serving as the idea that the bourgeoisie are going to make more and more money off of the workers because the workers need the jobs. And so if you don't go there, how are you going to support your family? Well, we can keep paying you less and less and less because you still have nowhere else to go. And the only way for the proletariat and the workers to overcome this is in the minds of Marx and Engels, to essentially have some sort of workers' revolution that will then achieve a better society and then kind of cast off the irons of, being mistreated. We will all produce for everyone, and there won't be any more inequality, and everyone will live essentially in a manner of speaking sort of happily ever after. And this becomes the idea of socialism turned into the idea of communism, all right, which is also connecting the idea of Marxism. These things kind of turn into each other. Now, mind you, the differences between socialism and communism are very, very different. Okay, or at least our modern version of socialism is the idea of you have government controlling certain aspects of the economy, but you still have obviously still a lot of private companies, private control of things, but the government does have control of some aspects of the economy. Communism, however, at the very furthest extent, if it was to be fully enacted, would mean, or at least within the government form before everything turns equal, is the government runs everything. There's not a whole lot of private entrepreneurship or private control. It's all public control, and the idea of living kind of in a utopian society kind of thing, right? And so over time, these ideas, again, for the working class, take more and more hold, especially as we will see going forward in Russia. Okay. So, and then some of the social reforms that actually end up happening during this time frame of the Industrial Revolution happen as a result of the fact that these socialist movements are gaining traction around the globe, including in the United States at this time. So they are done. So essentially, the better working conditions, limit of hours, limit of child labor, things of that nature are all done, including also the push for education. Some union rights are given at this point to essentially prevent revolutions and strikes, to offset the threat of a socialist revolution and the loss of control or power by the government, which again, Marx and Engels would say, they're just appeasing us to keep us down, would be kind of their response. But, there are things that are definitely good benefits, as I just kind of mentioned within all that, all right, as also we looked at previously. So there's also the idea of increase in implementation of pensions, sick pay, workers' compensation, the ideas of minimum wage, employee protections in case you get hurt on the job or you get fired. The beginning, as I said, with, the idea of recognizing trade unions or just unions in general, because you have to think about what unions face. Oftentimes they were illegal. People got kicked off the job. There were violent reactions to a lot of worker protests. And then also the increase in rights for voting for males throughout much of the Western world at this point. So yeah, I think we got Karl Marx here with his opium of the masses line from the Communist Manifesto. We have the first known worker factory protest known as the Luddites in the 18 teens. They were all violently put down and punished very, very severely in England. And then we have the Homestead strike here in the United States between workers and essentially like a private army to reopen a factory in Homestead, Pennsylvania. So kind of connecting to there. So then also looking at the effects, and kind of turning a whole 180 here, the effects of the Industrial Revolution abroad. Because the Industrial Revolution, as we know, spread well beyond the confines of England and Europe. Also gets into the United States, into some parts of Central and South America, as we've seen, but also Japan and other areas around the globe, again, for manufacturing purposes because it becomes cheaper. Okay, and so they invest in mechanization from profit from exported goods like we would see a little bit within South and Central America, but predominantly from the United States and Japan. Okay, so more products means that there's more resources that are needed to make those products, because if we're making cars, we need more rubber for tires. So hence we need to find more rubber and start, investing in the exporting of that in order to, again, make more money by selling cars. So this leads, again, to more political and economic colonialism and imperialism, which, again, we'll talk about with the imperialism chapter. More increased competition between European powers in the fight for, these natural resources to make products to get a stranglehold on the world. All right, this will also coincide with the rise of militarism and nationalism, which will help lead us into World War I. And then, as we've seen, a little bit within Latin America, and we'll expand again in the imperialism chapter, Other parts of the globe are now going to be more exported for natural resources to import, and then they will in turn be forced to import those finished products from those certain European countries. Okay, factories and plantations are often going to be owned by upper-class Europeans or just upper-class people within their own communities. Think again, the Creoles owning the means of production essentially in South and Central America. The upper and middle class now is starting to own these things in the United States. So Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, people like that. They will keep wages low, and little of that reinvestment will be put back into production in many of these places. In the United States, we know where it gets put. And there's low reinvestment in strong financial institutions like banks or loan agencies. Okay, they're forced into what we call free trade agreements and not allowing tariffs, so they can't protect their own businesses inside their own countries. So anytime they try to compete with them, they're already struggling to compete with the earlier manufacturing giants of the world who can produce faster, better, and cheaper and more efficiently. And the governments are either controlled, as we will see with imperialism, or influenced, as we see in Latin America, by a lot of wealthy Europeans, or just even wealthy people within their own country. And at the same time, because of urbanization and industrialization, this means you have fewer agricultural workers that are needed. So in many cases, we see mass migration from Europe around the world, and also beyond Europe as well, looking for jobs both in cities in their own countries and factories in cities around the globe. Okay. But this will also, as we'll see, include indentured servants moving around the globe as well, and also the formation of more settler colonies, with the British, with Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, similar to what we had seen previously, again, for, more mass migration. Okay, and then also at the same time, those social reforms, those social movements will continue to move. So the idea of socialism will continue to spread, nationalism, women's rights, those things will continue to be pressed forward into the future, as this kind of turns us around to the area of the 1900s.